Hello, folks. Happy today. Hope you're doing well. So today we look at the axial skeleton, uh, looking at portions through the skull. So when we think about the body, the axial skeleton is this longitudinal axis of the body. It's the central core of the body, and it includes the skull, the vertebral column, which protects the spinal cord, and then thoracic cage that protects the heart and lungs predominantly, but includes protecting things like the kidneys. All right, now the skull is two sort of sets of bones. There's the cranium that protects the brain, and then there are all the facial bones that protect some of the key sensory organs of the body. Now, your cranium is built of these bones that have basically fused together. They're joined together at connections called sutures. In sutures, they're sort of like interlocked joints stitched together with proteins, so they're basically immovable. So when these bones get stitched together, it forms one solid unit. So you'll notice sutures in the skull. When a person's born, the plates haven't fused yet to give room for brain development. But then as a person ages and brain growth slows, then the plates grow together, the sutures form, and you get one solid unit of bone. Now, looking at our first set of sutures here, we have the connections between the parietal bones. The parietal bones, those are like wings on top of the skull. So this would be sort of looking at these two bones that rest on top of the head. They're connected to one another along the midline at what's called a sagittal suture. We know a sagittal cut splits an organism into right and left. The sagittal suture connects the two parietal bones at the top of the skull. The frontal bone is where your forehead is. And a coronal suture, remember a frontal or coronal cut cuts an organism front and back pieces. The coronal suture connects the frontal bone to the parietal bone. So looking at the skull from the side, there's the frontal bone, here's the parietal bone, and here is that coronal suture that connects the two. If you look at the top of the skull, again, these are the two parietal bones, and that is the sagittal suture that connects them. Next, we're going to look at the temporal bones. Temporal bones are basically over your ears, and they have some sort of key identifying features. First of all, your parietal bones sit at the top, your temporal bones sit over your ear, and what connects your parietal bone to your temporal bone is called a squamous suture. So again, this would be just above your ear. There is a suture that connects your parietal bone at the top to that temporal bone. Things to see in the temporal bone, this external acoustic meatus, it's basically a small divot or hole in the side of the bone. That's where sound waves enter your ear. It's where you put a Q-tip, right? So this external acoustic meatus is basically just a little hole where sound can enter. There is a little styloid process. If you recall, processes are extensions of bone. The styloid process, think of like a stylus that people use to write on a screen. Muscles attached to that in your neck. And then there's this zygomatic process that you see. This forms part of your cheekbone. So if you go just in front of your ear, you can feel a bone. That is this zygomatic process. Other features that we find in temporal bone, there's a hole in the base of the skull called the jugular foramen. The jugular is an important vein that drains blood from the head. So there is a corresponding hole in the base of the skull to allow that blood vessel to exit the skull. Another bone marking that you can feel is called the mastoid process. This is behind your ear. So there's a little bump of bone behind your ear. That's the mastoid. And again, processes are where muscles attach. There's a muscle that attaches there. It's called the sternocleidomastoid. It attaches at this mastoid process, and then it attaches down in your sternum and clavicle. And when that contracts, it helps you turn your head. Okay. So again, this mastoid process is a site of muscle attachment. Now, it also has little air pockets or sinuses. So sometimes people get sinus infections and can have, or ear infections and can have inflammation in that mastoid process and feel pain. Okay, in the back of the skull, we have the occipital bone. That connects to the parietal bones with what's called a lambdoid suture. the Greek symbol lambda is sort of like an upside down Y. So if you can look at the back of the skull, um, between the coronal suture and the uh, occipital bone, you'll see this sort of upside down Y looking suture, and that's that lambdoid suture. The occipital bone has a major feature, and this is foramen magnum. Basically translates into a big hole. That's the big hole that your spinal cord passes through. Okay, so this occipital bone at the back extends down to the base of the skull, and there's a big hole in it. There are also these condyles, occipital condyles. They're little pads that connect to the topmost vertebra in your spine, the atlas. So this is what your whole skull rests on, are these two little pads in the occipital bone. All right, this is probably the toughest, or one of the more difficult bones to conceptualize. It's the sphenoid bone. So it's back behind the nasal cavity. And the sphenoid bone is sort of a bat-shaped or bird-shaped bone if you look at it from the top. So this is looking down into the skull. You'll see the shape of this. And again, it sort of looks like a moth or butterfly or bat or bird or whatever you want to consider it. And there are a couple of features here. One is an optic canal. That's a hole through which the optic nerve exits the back of the eye, and then that'll run back to the occipital lobe in your brain where you perceive sight. But there's basically a hole in that bone that the wiring exits through. Another important feature is here. It's called the sella turcica. It's like a little divot in the bone, and that's where your pituitary gland resides. The pituitary gland is sometimes called the master gland because it sends out all these different hormones to help regulate your body. And that gland is so important, it actually has a little bony surrounding there. Here's another image of the sphenoid bone. Again, this is looking at it from the top. Here, you can get a little better look. That's where the sella turcica is, that little divot in the bone where your pituitary gland rests. Now, here, I think is the most difficult bone to conceptualize. If we look this little grayed out portion here, that is what's called the ethmoid bone. So what I think is you smelleth with the ethmoid bone, okay? Now, there are a couple of things to notice. One, there are all these sinuses, right? This helps lighten the skull, and it also helps project the voice. But this sinus tissue is lined with mucous membranes, so it's also a place where people get infections, frequent infections, because if you have something that's warm and moist and protected, that's a great place for pathogens to grow. Now, an interesting feature here is what's called the cribriform plate. The cribriform plate has a bunch of little holes in it, and what happens is the base of your brain rests on the ethmoid bone, and then little extensions extend through these holes, and those are receptors for smell. So this is in the nasal cavity, and you can see how the bone is all curved like this, and it causes air to swirl, and then the air swirls, lands on these receptors that extend through the cribriform plate and stimulates those receptors, and we smell different things. So this bone has these tiny little holes, which is important for allowing receptors to pass through so you can smell. So that's the cranium. Now let's move on to the facial bones. The maxilla, that's the purplish bone that we see here. It makes the upper jaw. I just remember the maxilla is the mustache bone. So again, the maxilla, it's part of the upper jaw, and it has sockets for teeth. Paranasal sinuses, that's like in the ethmoid bone. Again, they help lighten the skull, and those little holes act as like resonance chambers to help project the voice. Palatine bones, it's the posterior part of the hard palate. So if you stick your thumb like way back in your mouth, the palatine bones help form the roof of your mouth. Here, in the sort of greenish, grayish, bluish color, those are the zygomatic bones. Those are your cheekbones. It's real tough to see, but in green there, right on the inside of the eye socket, these are lacrimal bones. And lacrimal bones have a tiny little hole in them for your tears to pass through. The lower jaw here is the mandible. And again, it's got sockets for teeth. And this is interesting because in the whole head, it's the only movable bone. Okay. Here's just a little crisper image of that stuff. Okay. So that takes care of that. As you work through this, if you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, keep your head about you, and I hope you have a great day.